The Forest Oasis. She transformed a ghost town into a sustainable forest sanctuary for homeless families. The town that had given up. Ashvale, former mining village, South Yorkshire, spring 2024. The town of Ashvale had been dying for 30 years before Miriam Okafor arrived with a rucksack, a surveying notebook, and 12,000 tree seedlings ordered on a credit card she was 90% certain she had no business using. The main street was a museum of collapse. Shop fronts with their signs still partially legible, a chemist, a hardware shop, something that had once been a pub, stood behind boards that had themselves begun to rot. The pavements had cracked so thoroughly that tufts of grass and dock leaves rose from the splits, not like weeds reclaiming something, but like small, patient arguments. The old miners' welfare hall, last used in 1994, had lost its roof on one side to a winter storm and never been repaired. Pigeons had colonized the gap. It had been a proper town once, 300 families at its height, clustered around the colliery that employed almost every man and many of the women. When the pit closed in 1992, the town did not immediately die. These things rarely happen immediately. It slowly emptied, the way a bath drains. The young leaving first to Sheffield and Leeds and Manchester, then the middle-aged following their children, then the elderly dying and not being replaced. By 2010, Ashvale had 47 permanent residents. By 2020, 11. By the spring of 2024, when Miriam walked its main street for the first time with her notebook open and her eyes moving over the desolation with an expression her colleagues described as meditative and her critics described as delusional, Ashvale was officially a ghost town. The 11 residents had all gone. Miriam stood in the middle of the empty street for a long time. Then she wrote 3 words in her notebook. She was 41 years old. She had been homeless twice, once at 19 and once at 32, and she understood from the inside what homelessness did to a person's relationship with the future, the way it compressed time into an endless and precarious present, the way it made planning feel not just difficult, but somehow absurd, as though the future were a country you had been forbidden to enter. She had also spent 15 years as an ecological restoration specialist, working on rewilding projects across the UK, watching degraded land slowly relearn what it was supposed to be. She had looked at Ashvale and seen something nobody else had bothered to see. She had seen both problems solved by each other. Miriam Okafor. Miriam Grace Okafor had grown up in Hackney, the daughter of a Nigerian-born secondary school science teacher named Joseph and a Sheffield-born community nurse named Carol, the second of 4 children in a house where the bookshelves were full and the kitchen table was never empty of people or conversation. It was a good childhood, warm and busy and intellectually alive, and it had given her, she believed, the particular confidence of someone who was always encouraged to ask why. The confidence had not been sufficient preparation for what happened at 19. Her parents separated. The family home was sold. Carol moved in with her sister. Joseph moved in with a colleague. Miriam, in her first year at Keele University studying ecology and environmental science, fell through the gap. The student hall she had been allocated was oversubscribed. She was told there had been an administrative error. She spent 3 months sleeping on friends' sofas and, for 6 weeks, in a hostel in Stoke-on-Trent that was adequate, in the way that adequate rarely quite is. She completed her degree from the hostel. She did not tell her tutors. She received a first-class honors and a letter of commendation for her final dissertation, a field study on natural regeneration in post-industrial brownfield sites in the East Midlands. The brownfield sites were the thing that stayed with her, the way that land written off by industry, filled, poisoned, compacted, covered in concrete and then abandoned, could, if left alone long enough or helped back towards itself, recover with extraordinary fidelity. Pioneer plants arriving first, then shrubs, then trees, the slow, patient intelligence of ecological succession. She had stood in a former ironworks near Nottingham that was now, 40 years after closure, 30 years since anyone had actively managed it, a functioning ancient structure woodland, with a canopy and a shrub layer and a ground flora of bluebells and wood anemone, and she had thought, the land remembers what it's supposed to be, it just needs the pressure taken off it. The second episode of homelessness at 32 had been briefer but harder, a relationship ending badly, a shared tenancy in Bristol that dissolved with the relationship, a rental market that had become almost comically unnavigable for a single woman on an ecological consultant's salary. She had been housed in emergency accommodation for 11 weeks. She was 32 years old, professionally established, well regarded in her field, and she had nonetheless sat in a temporary room in Bristol with her ecological survey kit under the bed and understood in the specific and private way of someone the system has reminded of its rules, that security is not something you earn permanently. It can be taken from you by a combination of bad luck and an indifferent market, and the combination is much more common than people who have never experienced it tend to believe. It was in Bristol that the idea began, not fully formed, not yet the vision it would become, but the seed of it. What if the solution to homelessness and the solution to degraded, abandoned land were the same solution? What if the surplus of one problem, too much unused, derelict space in post-industrial Britain, could directly address the deficit of another? She spent 9 years developing it. She studied sustainable building, straw bale construction, timber frame design. She applied for funding 12 times and was rejected 11. She built partnerships with 3 housing charities, a Forestry Commission regional officer, a structural engineer she had met at a conference in 2019, and a community land trust specialist who told her on their 3rd meeting that she was the most systematically committed person she had ever encountered in 20 years of working in social housing. Then, in the autumn of 2023, she found Ashvale. The vision, what she saw in the ruins. Ashvale, the survey, autumn 2023. The South Yorkshire Council had been paying minimal maintenance costs on Ashvale for a decade and trying to sell it for 8. There had been no serious offers. The infrastructure was too degraded for conventional development and too isolated for the commuter belt conversion that had revived some similarly derelict settlements closer to Sheffield. Ashvale was, in the specific language of planning documents, a community asset of nil commercial value. Miriam spent 3 weeks surveying it. She walked every street. She tested the soil in 47 locations, collecting samples with the methodical attention of someone who was listening to the land rather than assessing it. She photographed the surviving buildings, the ones that could be renovated versus the ones that had gone too far. She charted the water table, the drainage patterns, the existing tree cover, a row of mature sycamores along the north edge of what had been the school playing fields, an elder thicket behind the welfare hall, some self-seated birch in the former car park. She noted the way the valley sheltered the site from the prevailing west wind. She noted the south-facing slope of the main street, the quality of light. She found 17 buildings that could be made structurally sound at reasonable cost and converted to quality homes using sustainable building methods. She identified 12 acres of cleared ground, former gardens, roads, car parks, that could be planted without any demolition. She found the remains of the colliery allotments on the north side, where the soil was still rich despite 30 years of neglect. She presented her proposal to the council in January 2024. It was called the Ashvale Community Forest Trust. The headline, 17 renovated homes for homeless families, set within a 12-acre community forest planted and managed by the residents themselves. The forest would provide timber for future building and repair, food through an integrated orchard and growing system, income through managed woodland products, charcoal, coppiced wood, wildflower seeds, and above all, permanence. The families who came to Ashvale would not be housed temporarily. They would be given long-term community land trust tenancies, which meant the homes could never be sold off to private buyers, could never be taken from them by a rising property market. They were there to stay. The council approved the community interest company structure in February 2024. They transferred the land on a 125-year lease for a peppercorn rent, citing regeneration and environmental benefit. Miriam received the documents by email on a Thursday morning, sitting in her van outside a service station on the M1, and read them 3 times. Then she called her structural engineer, Tom Bashir, and said, "We've got the site. We've got the lease. I need you in Ashvale on Monday." "Tom, I know. I've already booked the Monday." The first arrivals, 3 families, 1 empty town. Ashvale, May 2024. The first 3 families arrived on a Tuesday in May. Miriam had wanted May. She had been specific about this, in the way that people who understand ecological timing are specific. The tree planting season runs late autumn to early spring, and she had already planted 8,000 of the 12,000 saplings through the winter with a volunteer team from 2 Sheffield universities. By May, the earliest plantings were in leaf, and she wanted the families to arrive to green, not to bare sticks. It worked. The birch and willow plantings along what had been the main street had leafed out into something recognizable as a beginning, thin still, young, but unmistakably alive. The sycamores along the school fields were in full leaf. Miriam had arranged for the 3 family homes to be the most complete of the renovation works. Not perfect, but habitable, warm, genuinely beautiful. Tom Bashir had insisted on beauty as a structural requirement. His words at a planning meeting: "A temporary shelter is a temporary shelter. A beautiful home is something people will fight to protect." The 3 families were Blessing and Marcus Webb, with their 3 children aged 4, 7, and 10, who had been in temporary accommodation in Sheffield for 14 months after Marcus lost his job in a warehouse closure, and the family lost the flat tied to his employment. Blessing was a healthcare assistant. She had kept working throughout, but a single NHS salary in 2024 Sheffield did not cover the deposit plus the first month plus the second month that the private rental market had come to require. They had been on the council housing list for 3 years. They had been offered 2 properties in that time. One had been immediately withdrawn. One had had mold in every room. Patricia and her daughter Aisha, 13, who had spent 4 years in supported housing following domestic abuse. Patricia was a qualified bookkeeper who had rebuilt her professional practice from scratch. She had good income, references, a clean tenancy record. Landlords still turned her down when they discovered she was coming from supported housing, because of assumptions about prior tenancies that were not hers to own. She applied for 43 private rentals in the past year. She had been offered 0. Daniel Ose, no relation to Miriam, with his son Kwame, 9, and his elderly mother Abena, 73, who had cared for Abena since Kwame's birth, and whose family of 3 had been living in a 2-room hostel for 8 months since the private landlord who had rented them a house in Rotherham sold the property to an investor who needed vacant possession. The eviction was legal. The homelessness was the direct consequence. 3 families, different routes to the same cliff edge, different ages, different histories, different specific difficulties, all of them with the particular quality Miriam had seen in her own 2 periods of homelessness, the exhausted alertness of people who are managing constant uncertainty and have not been allowed to stop managing it long enough to feel what it's costing them. She stood at the end of the main street on the Tuesday morning and watched the 3 vehicles arrive. She had met all 3 families during the selection process, but she was not certain until this moment that they would actually come, that they would bring their children to an empty town with a half-planted forest and take the risk of something nobody had tried before. Blessing Webb got out of the car first, with the 4-year-old on her hip, and stood in the street and looked at it. She looked at the young trees, at the cleaned-up frontage of the house that would be theirs, at the way the valley curved around the site like a held breath. "It looks like somewhere." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Miriam understood exactly what she meant. It looked like somewhere, not a temporary place, not an emergency measure, somewhere. The difficulty, what nobody had warned them about. Ashvale, summer 2024. The difficulty was not the trees. The trees, given reasonable conditions and enough water in the first summer, largely got on with things. The difficulty was not the buildings, though they were relentless in their demands. Tom Bashir was on site 4 days a week through June and July, managing a team of 7 builders, including 2 apprentices he had specifically recruited from a Sheffield construction training program for young people with care experience. The difficulty was time. The weight of the work against the needs of 3 families with children, one of whom had a child with complex health needs. one of whom was still processing trauma at a pace that did not bend to construction schedules, and one of whom had an elderly mother who needed care during the days when Daniel was digging foundations and laying drainage. Miriam had planned for this. She had built a community support framework into the project from the beginning, with funding from a housing charity for a community support worker 2 days a week. What she had not planned for was the specific weight of asking people who had been through the hardest years of their lives to also be pioneers, to also be the proof of concept, to also represent for funders and journalists and the housing policy community the evidence that this approach worked. It was Patricia who named this most directly. 6 weeks into the project, at one of the weekly community meetings Miriam ran in the welfare hall, whose roof had now been repaired, whose interior smelled of fresh plaster and linseed oil, Patricia said, carefully and with the precision of someone who has learned to speak clearly in situations of high stakes, "I need to say something about the way this is being talked about. When journalists come here and call us brave and inspiring, what I hear is, your suffering is educational for other people. I am not here to be an inspiration. I am here to build a home. I need those things to stay separate." The room was quiet for a moment. Miriam looked at her. She had thought about this. She had tried to build the project so that it was never a charity, always a community. But Patricia was right. The attention brought by funders and press had a gravitational pull toward a particular narrative, one in which the families were objects of the story rather than its subjects. "You're right, and it's my responsibility to manage that boundary, not yours. I'll set new press access rules this week. The families control their own stories here. Always." She meant it, and she did it. The press access policy was revised within the week, giving each family full control over their own participation in any media coverage. It was adopted, without being named, as a standard within the community's governance documents. Patricia had not planned to shape the project's principles. She had simply said what was true, and the project had incorporated it. This, Miriam believed, was how the project was supposed to work. Not top-down, never top-down. Turning point: the first winter and what held. Ashvale, December 2024. The first winter was the test. Everyone involved understood this, without quite saying it. The funders whose tranches depended on continued progress, the housing charity whose professional reputation had been staked on the model, Tom Bashir, who had deferred 40% of his fees to take the risk with Miriam, and the 3 families themselves, who had entered winter in an isolated former ghost town with young trees, an unfinished 4th and 5th home, and the knowledge that the first frost would reveal the quality of every decision made in the preceding 8 months. The first frost came in November. The roof insulation held. The ground source heating system that Tom had specified, significantly more expensive up front than conventional gas, which Miriam had argued for in the original budget, at the cost of 3 sleepless nights and 2 conversations with funders who took significant persuading, performed exactly as the specification had promised. The homes were warm. The Webb children played in the frost-covered former car park in the mornings and came home to warm kitchens. The trees held too. Losses were within the predicted range for first-year plantings, 17% against the 20% Miriam had budgeted. The remaining 83% were dormant in the way of young trees in winter, apparently dead, but not dead, patient, conserving energy, waiting for spring. On a December evening, Miriam walked the main street by herself. It was cold and dark at 4 in the afternoon, in the way only a South Yorkshire December can be, with a low gray sky and frost beginning to crystallize on the remaining cracked pavement. The lights were on in the 3 occupied houses. Through one window, she could see Blessing Webb moving in the kitchen, something warm on the hob, the 4-year-old at her feet. Through another window, the blue light of a television in the room where Daniel's mother Abina spent her evenings. The third house, Patricia's curtains drawn, the warm strip of light under them. 3 lit windows in a town that had been dark for 3 years. Miriam stopped. She stood in the cold and looked at the light. She had been carrying something for 15 years, since the hostel in Stoke, since the Bristol temporary room, since the 12 funding rejections and the thousands small indignities of trying to do a significant thing with insufficient resources in a system not designed to be helped. 3 lit windows. She let herself feel it, just for a moment, the particular, specific, unhysterical relief of something working. Then she walked on. There was a board meeting in the welfare hall in 40 minutes, and she had 4 agenda items that needed preparation. Breakthrough and resolution. Ashvale in 2026. Ashvale Woodland Community Trust. Spring 2026. 2 springs after Miriam Okafor walked an empty street with a notebook and an overextended credit card, Ashvale looks like a different place and the same place simultaneously. The main street still has its Victorian bones, the shopfronts, the pub that is now a community kitchen and seed library, the welfare hall that is now the project's meeting space and educational center. But between and around and through these bones, the forest has arrived. The birch plantings from the first winter are now 3 meters tall in the best spots, their silver bark catching the April light. The willow along the drainage corridor has thickened into a proper stand. The 12 apple, pear, and plum trees planted in the old school grounds came into blossom last week for the first time. Aisha, Patricia's daughter, sent Miriam a photograph of them, pale pink against the gray Yorkshire sky, with the message, "Look what we did." The project now has 11 occupied homes. 8 of the 17 renovated properties are complete. 3 more will be ready before autumn. The community has 28 residents, 6 families and 2 individuals, with a waiting list that tells a story of how deep the housing crisis cuts across English life. Teachers, care workers, a former army medic, a university administrator, an accountant, a single father with 4 children, all of them in housing need of one kind or another, all of them assessed by the community's own membership process rather than a local authority housing register. The community forest management work has become, in ways that surprised even Miriam, a genuine form of livelihood. Daniel Oasis trained as a woodland management practitioner through an online course and a practical placement arranged with a Yorkshire Forestry partnership. He is now the community's paid woodland manager, earning a real salary from the charcoal and coppiced wood and wildflower seed production that the forest is beginning to generate in commercial quantities. Blessing Webb, whose background is in healthcare, has set up a community health program that brings healthcare workers from Sheffield out to the site monthly. Patricia is the project's administrator and data officer. Her bookkeeping background, which no private landlord would give credit for, has been applied to the Community Land Trust's finances with the thoroughness of someone who knows exactly what numbers mean and why they matter. The books are clean. The project has broken even in its 3rd year of operation and is on track to become financially self-sustaining by 2027, entirely without ongoing grant dependency. There have been challenges that Miriam had not fully anticipated. The isolation of a rural site, though partially mitigated by the community's internal social life and a reliable car share scheme to Sheffield, is real for children and teenagers. Aisha has managed it better than Miriam had feared. She has friends in the project and at 14 is old enough to navigate the bus route to Sheffield independently, but it is a genuine constraint of the model, and Miriam is honest about it. There was a significant planning dispute in 2025 when a property developer filed an objection to the project's community land trust status, arguing that the lease terms were inconsistent with surrounding land values. The objection was ultimately rejected by the planning inspector, who cited the ecological, social, and economic benefits of the project in terms that Miriam read 3 times and then laminated and put on the wall of the welfare hall. But the dispute was costly, in time, in legal fees, in the specific exhaustion of having to defend a project that was self-evidently working against an argument that was self-evidently about something other than its stated subject. She had called her mother, Carol, during the worst week of the legal process, sitting in her van outside the welfare hall at 11 at night with the court documents on the passenger seat. Carol: "How bad is it?" Miriam: "It's manageable, but it's costly, and it's the kind of thing that's designed to exhaust you into giving up." Carol: "Are you going to give up?" Miriam: "No." Carol: "Then it isn't designed well enough." The planning inspector's decision came 6 weeks later. Miriam announced it at the community meeting, and the welfare hall, 28 residents, volunteers from the university partnerships, Tom Bashir in the back row, made a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite a collective exhale, and was entirely itself. Outside, the birch trees stood in the April light. 9. The lesson: what Ashvale teaches. What Miriam Okafor's project has proved. Miriam speaks at housing conferences now. She is a composed speaker, methodical, specific, impatient with the rhetorical habits of the sector. She does not begin with her personal story. She begins with the numbers: acres planted, tons of carbon sequestered, homes built, families housed, cost per home compared to conventional social housing, income generated per family per year from woodland management. Then, when the numbers have established the argument, she says, "The land was wasted. The people were treated as waste. We put them together and watched both recover. That is not a metaphor. That is what actually happened. If you want to solve homelessness, stop looking at it as a housing problem. Start looking at it as a land use problem, a community building problem, and a confidence problem in our capacity to imagine something genuinely different from what we already have."